This is the way it looks today. But in the early 60s,
1960 to 65 were really like the boom years. Hot Springs never saw anything like it.
author David Hill is a native son.
We all grew up around these stories. You know, we all grew up around kind of the legends of the old days in Hot Springs. And I think my whole life I kind of maybe took it for granted.
But when he wrote a short piece on Hot Springs gambling for ESPN, he realized his Hot Springs was a hot commodity.
And the response to that piece really surprised me because folks were really interested and wanted to hear more about this little bit of history and they'd never heard about it before.
He had whet the national appetite and got to work, using the Freedom of Information Act to gain access to Department of Justice and FBI files. He made a startling discovery.
There were FBI offices all over America that had files on Hot Springs, not just the Arkansas office.
And those files revealed a misconception many locals had, that gambling flourished because elected officials simply turned a blind eye and had nothing to do with organized crime.
And I think what shocked me when I was doing research was how untrue that was and how much not only was gambling in Hot Springs actually connected to the sort of larger syndicate and the larger sort of world of organized crime in America, but also that like the real story about how Hot Springs was able to survive had a lot to do with political corruption. That was different than what I had learned and been told growing up.
And by the early 60s, Hot Springs had reached a tipping point.
There was this huge construction boom in Hot Springs in the early 1960s in anticipation of gambling being legalized there.
Remnants of that boom remain. The 60s style architecture is dominant, including the building that housed the Vapors. Crowds came to gamble, and big-time entertainers came to entertain those crowds, which then produced even bigger crowds.
During those short 4 to 5 years was when things really spiked and things, where Hot Springs saw literally, 5 million visitors a year.
But on January 3rd, 1963, the Vapors was bombed. The next day, when pictures were on the front page of the Arkansas Gazette, it was confirmation of the hold illicit gambling had on Hot Springs. Within 5 years, gambling was shut down by then-Governor Winthrop Rockefeller.
After gambling was shut down, there was such a sort of deliberate effort to sweep it all under the rug.
There are no regrets of lost glory in Hill's book. He maintains Hot Springs still thrives because it's so unique. But his book serves one primary purpose.
It's just a piece of history that I think people are surprised that they don't know.
Centered around a nightclub named for the byproduct of the famous Hot Springs, the Vapors.